8 minutes past 12. Robert Palmer, Addicted to Love. This is BBC Radio Wales. Keep your texts coming, 8, 10, 12, and your emails, jason@bbc.co.uk. How do we tackle extremism in British society? The Prime Minister, David Cameron, has set up a task force following the murder of drummer Lee Rigby in Woolwich last month. Earlier this week, we reported on the arson attack on an Islamic community centre in Muswell Hill, which counter-terrorism police are investigating. One wall was daubed with the letters EDL, apparently referring to the English Defence League, though it has denied any involvement. Let's talk to the political and social commentator Mohammed Ansar. Mohammed, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Jason.
Welcome to BBC Radio Wales. Let's start with the EDL, shall we? How do we stop white working class men from being radicalised by the far right? So often on this programme we discuss radicalisation of young Muslim men. Let's start with white working class men.
I think at the minute we live in a time where the tinder has become incredibly dry over the last few years. We have allowed myths and misconceptions about Islam and Muslims to conflate with arguments around multiculturalism, the political agenda. There's mass dissatisfaction and disenfranchisement due to the economic downturn. And all of these rivers, all of these streams are conflating into one lake, which is incredibly unhelpful, because what it means is that I think there were some recent statistics out for the Islamophobia all-party parliamentary group, which said 75% of Britons know little or nothing about Islam, and 2/3 of the ones that do say they only get their source of information from the media. And if you spend your days reading certain tabloid headlines, looking at the headlines around grooming and around terrorism, it's understandable why they would have such misinformation, and I would go further to say disinformation about Muslims out there.
Mohammed, where were you born?
I was born in Watford in Hertfordshire. I'm very proud to say so.
Proud to be British?
Absolutely.
Yeah. You've met and spoken to the EDL. That's a pretty brave thing to do.
Initially, when the Home Secretary was calling for hate groups to be prescribed and banned, and people like Al-Muhajirun and Anjem Choudhury's lot were being banned, which I completely agree with, I couldn't understand for the life of me why they had decided not to ban the EDL, who are peddling hate, who are dividing communities, who are really stoking the flames of this storm, which is beginning to burn quite brightly across the country. And so, I had initially called for them to be banned. Eventually, I decided, look, I can't necessarily agree that banning them is the answer, so we have to get on a level playing field with them, have a face-to-face dialogue, and we have to, using our democratic systems, to have the argument, to have the debate, and to answer the questions they have. And some of them are rational, but many of them are irrational fears, and we need to address them.
What was it like discussing it with EDL? Did they have time for you? Did they listen to you?
I've had face-to-face dialogue with Tommy Robinson, the leader of the EDL, last year on BBC One. I've had more face-to-face discussions since, and hopefully we'll have more. He does understand some of these issues. However, I believe that the political rhetoric, the rhetoric of hate and division of the right, has become so intense now that he's almost at a situation where he's struggling to roll it back. I'm not saying he's beyond help. As a person of faith, I would never say that, and I will continue to reach out and continue to do outreach work with him. What I am concerned about, though, is those on the political right, people like Douglas Murray, others who are conflating Islam and Muslims with the actions of some twisted and deluded criminal individuals, and that kind of stuff is incredibly unhelpful.
How do we deal with radical clerics from the Muslim community?
There is, I think there's a vacuum in this country. We have an overwhelming need for dynamic British Muslim leadership. We can't keep sending back to the old country, if you like, to bring Muslims over here to lead, our mosques, our places of worship. We need more social leaders. We need more people of faith coming forward. So there's a gap around education. We need to build better bridges with other different community groups. But it's really important for the government to be tackling extremism in all forms. And whilst we allow people like Anjem Choudhury and Tommy Robinson to have huge amounts of airtime given on public platforms to really advocate for their views, people are getting a very, very skewed view of actually what Britain is. And I think we're far more tolerant and far more appreciative of the nuance in the argument. And it's almost sickening to see the dumbing down of this debate.
Let me just ask you about, say, for example, Nick Griffin. the leader of the BNP. Tommy Robinson, you've mentioned the leader of the EDL. Should we invite people like that onto a programme like this?
I think these are really difficult questions. I completely understand why organisations like Hope Not Hate and others in the past have said we don't support any platform for these individuals. However, anybody who saw the Question Time with Nick Griffin would have agreed that he came across incredibly badly and shot himself in the foot, essentially. And sometimes sunlight is the best disinfectant, and we need to shine a light on these people, on their ideologies, because whether we like it or not, this idea of not engaging hasn't really been successful. The far right have increased across Europe and across the UK, and I think the government, the Prime Minister, the task force really needs to start taking positive steps at clamping down on this stuff.
Lots of stuff coming through on Twitter and on the text, Mohammed. Let's read out a few comments from Margaret in Cardiff, who says, families of radicals should be more responsible, shop them to the police if necessary. Entire Muslim families should be deported if they have an extremist family member. Bill in Cowbridge, I want a law passed in Parliament which states that any Muslim radicalised in this country, irrespective of whether they were born here, should be sent back to their roots. What do you say to some of the listeners' comments coming in?
Firstly, some of the radicalised and extremists, and I'll say criminals, not terrorists, I think it's important to make the distinction, like the Woolwich killers, they were born and bred here. There's this kind of language of forcible expulsions and making life hard across the board for Muslims is the kind of disturbing rhetoric that we saw in 1930s Germany, in pre-Nazi area against the Jewish population there. And I think, my grandfather fought for the British forces in the Second World War, and many others did too. And we need to remain conscious of the fact that we have a long and proud tradition of standing up against fascism and fascist ideologies. If the middle territory in this country has shifted to the right, then that is something we need to address. And it's not helped by political parties also shifting to the right. Those people who have given those messages and tweets and phone calls, I understand where you're coming from, and I really genuinely feel the anxiety that you are feeling. However, persecuting Muslims across the board isn't the answer. We need to tackle this in a sensible and clear-headed and cool-mannered way.
Right, Mohammed, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. You mentioned Douglas Murray. Well, I'm delighted to say that Douglas Murray will be joining us in a few minutes. Let's say good afternoon to the writer and broadcaster Douglas Murray. Hello, Douglas.
Hello, good to
Hi,
meet you.
nice to have you on the programme. How do we stop young Muslim people from being radicalised, in your opinion?
Well, there are a whole range of things. It's not an easy matter. One thing, of course, which gets a lot of attention is to ensure that figures like Anjem Choudhury, who has been a lot of focus on in recent days, and quite rightly, are not able to freely spew a hateful message, which people therefore can not only be attracted to, but can also think is somehow tolerated. There's a lot more that needs to be done in wider society, including just in civic society, not in legal terms, just in terms of people, for instance, treating radical Islamic extremism in the same way and with the same disdain and the same horror that they treat, for instance, the British National Party and racism and so on. So, there's a lot to be done. Some of it can be done at community levels. Some of it is simply done by good policing and enforcement of the law. But it's not any one of these things. It's a whole toolbox of things.
You've written recently about Anjem Choudhury. Should he be thrown out?
Well, where to? I suggest he should be put in prison, and I've suggested, I think, in yesterday's Daily Mail, exactly the laws which I think he very clearly has broken, and which he should go to prison for. There has been, I think, a flawed policy in recent years by the security service and police of allowing him to be out in the open, partly in order to keep him under observation and to observe those people who would be attracted to him. I think that process has failed. It has failed in two ways. One of the murderers of Lee Rigby had obviously been on that radar and had flipped off it, so it's not fail-safe. And secondly, allowing this kind of hate preaching to go on unchallenged, I think creates a huge gulf between the general public and the police, prosecution authorities and so on, where people see, for instance, an 85-year-old grandmother handcuffed outside a mosque saying horrible things, by all accounts, about Muslims, and yet see Anjem Choudhury saying horrible things about all sorts of people, including Muslims, and remaining...
Well, Douglas, now we're getting to the crux of where I want to take this next discussion. You have an e-book out now called Islamophilia. What do you mean by the title? Is it the central premise that public figures are scared of being critical about Islam right now in the UK?
Yes, I mean my ebook Islamophilia is really it's a send up of those ridiculous. It's not about Muslims, it's not about Islam. It's about those ridiculous public figures, from presidents and prime ministers and politicians to pop stars and actors and artists and writers, who say only nice things about Islam, where they criticize all other religion. They say only nice things about Islam, largely because they're fearful.
Mohammed Ansar is listening to you, Douglas. Mohammed, what do you have to say?
Douglas is part of the problem, truth be told. And on a personal basis, Douglas and I have done television together, and he's very personable, and I agree with much of what he says around the details of Anjem Choudary and others. However, comments like forcibly exporting Muslims who plot, assist or condone violence against the West, saying that conditions for Muslims in Europe must be made harder across the board, that Europe must look like a less attractive proposition, making statements that demonise all Muslims in Islam, conflating Islam and extremism. And even Paul Goodman, who runs the Conservative Home website, has said that Douglas Murray needs to disown his arguments that he's made, and that the Conservative and the mainstream right have distanced themselves from Douglas Murray. And denying that Islamophobia is a hate crime, denying that Islamophobia is like anti-Semitism, all of these things are being perpetrated by Douglas, and this is creating a wedge. It's creating fear and hostility. And Douglas, you need to start looking at yourself, my friend. And
what are you suggesting then? Are you saying that writers like Douglas are responsible then for the rise in the number of white working class men and boys who want to join the EDL? Is that what you're saying?
I think there are people at the minute who are making a career out of stopping good people in society coming together to stand up against hate, division and disunity. And Douglas Murray is stoking and is
Okay, I need to get
flames.
Douglas to respond to this. Douglas?
Well, first of all, Mohammed Ansar is simply making the most offensive and most gratuitous and silly argument he can make. But if he wants to start taking things that he selects about me out of context, I could perfectly well cite, and Mo Ansar, as he calls himself on Twitter, a row he had with the historian Tom Holland recently, where Mohammed, who said recently, and I quote, "If slaves are treated justly, with full rights and no oppression, why would anyone object?" You know, Mohammed, it's part of the problem, this, isn't it? That you come on things like this and present yourself in one light. You pretend that your opponents are all terrible, vicious Islamophobes and racists and far-right and so on and so forth. But until people like you deal with the primary problem of Islamic extremism, the secondary and undeniable problem of the reaction to that cannot itself be addressed.
Douglas, listen, I have come out repeatedly in the media, in the television, on the radio to condemn Islamic extremism, Anjem Choudary, the acts in Woolwich. Now, I think Douglas, I think you need to a discussion between me and Tom Holland is a friend of mine, and he's come out clearly and said that our discussion was an academic discussion about history in ancient times and slavery in ancient times. Look,
Douglas, let him finish and I'll get you back in.
I think it's fair only to respond to what you've said as you've responded to what I've said. Look, the discussion between myself and Tom Holland, and Tom's come out recently, you can look at his tweets, discusses a conversation about the historical context of slavery in ancient times and whether it was a good thing, a bad thing, and how people were treated. And I have condemned slavery in all its forms across the board, so there's no question there. Now, the argument is this, which is that you are denying Islamophobia is real, despite the fact that we have Tell Mama, which is an organisation who monitors Islamophobic hate crimes. Since Woolwich, we've had 200 attacks on Muslims, we've had 10 attacks on mosques, 1 burnt to the ground. Now, we need to stop this nonsensical and tired rhetoric, which has been rejected by the mainstream media, rejected by the public, and now it's been rejected by the mainstream politicians on the right. You have to accept that anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, these are hate crimes, and I'm asking you now, will you acknowledge Islamophobia is real, and will you stand against it?
I did not acknowledge it's real, and I'll explain why. First of all, the example you just cited of Tell Mama, you're completely wrong. Last Sunday in the Sunday Telegraph, Andrew Gilligan did an expose of this claim you've just made. Most of the things you describe as attacks on Muslims were things put on Twitter, on Facebook pages, and so on. Now look, I've already put it to you. It's perfectly clear how to unpick this problem. We deal with the primary issue of Islamic extremism, which is a serious problem. groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir, which you have yourself had no problem about promoting on your Twitter feed as
And
well,
how have I promoted them? Sorry, how have I promoted them?
Can I just finish? These are part of the problem. You join me in dealing with Islamic extremism and the reaction to that extremism, this terrible thing, which I acknowledge does exist. There are people who hate Muslims. That is not Islamophobia, by the way. Islamophobia is a term that is meant to encompass everything, including any criticism of Islam. Now, there are people, and I have written this and said this many times, who may well decide that they hate Muslims or all Muslims or so on. And I condemn that, and I have done repeatedly.
Can I just ask you one final question?
And I am asking you,
Douglas, we're running out of time.
Join me in dealing with the primary problem, and the secondary problem can be dealt with and will fall.
Okay.
Douglas, sorry, Jason, just say, Douglas, I have been dealing with Islamic extremism on national, local and government programs for the last 5 or 6 years. I'm not sure you've ever delivered a program to actually deal with grassroots level extremism, whereas I have. So actually,
okay, listen, we're running out of time. We're running out of time. We're running out of time, and I got a feeling that you two guys will go around in circles. I just want to push it on just a little bit further. Douglas, we had a sheikh on the program 2 weeks ago, and he came on the program, and not very often you hear an imam coming onto a live radio program to discuss whether the Muslim community is doing enough. He stressed for a half an hour that they are doing their very best to heal rifts within the community and also to root out any possible extremists that might exist within the UK Islamic circle and in mosques. Do you trust the Muslim community? Do you think that community is doing enough to root out these extremists?
There's no such thing as a community. There are communities, all sorts of different voices from within Islam. Some people in this country are undoubtedly doing as much as they can. Some people are doing more than they can. But is there a problem that needs to be tackled more and harder and better and with more people? Yes, undoubtedly. Not enough is being done across the board. I would like to see more. I think we can deal with this problem. We need to deal with the primary problem, and then the reactions to that problem will fall away.
Right. Thank you for your answer, Mohammed.
Mosques and Muslim communities, and I agree with Douglas on this, that Muslim communities, and we should address them as that, they are across the board working absolute to their limits in terms of tackling this. When we are talking about disenfranchisement, and we're talking about 80% of the British Muslim community are on or below the poverty line, we are talking about white extremism and disenfranchisement. You know, for people like Douglas and mainstream commentators who do not condone across the board acts of Islamophobia and in fact deny that it exists is a problem. What we need to do is come together as communities. We need to unite. We need to increase the knowledge and understanding and tolerance of different communities. The intolerance and this lean and this lurch to the far right, it must stop. And good people across the country, I believe they will unite and stop this.
Thank you both very much indeed. What a riveting discussion. Thank you very much indeed.